This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Eric Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not.
All right. So Eric and I just talking business for a bit, and then I said we got to get back to this business. And today we have what Eric has called the smorgasbord episode, where we're going to address some criticism. We're going to talk about some shit we want to talk about that doesn't really dedicate a full episode, but things that we think are important, and probably a few other little things in between.
Yeah. So what do we want to do today is just talk about some of these episodes that we've done in the past. We had some comments on them, a lot of good, a little bit of bad. So I thought maybe we just talk about it. And also there's a few things I didn't get to in some of these other episodes. And if we have time, we'll jump into a few other topics. So I want to go back in time. So if you're listening to this right now, check out, if you haven't already listen to the Imposter Syndrome episode. It's episode 10. And this was kind of a combination episode where we talked about imposter syndrome, and then we talked about negative mindsets. So we talked about like what people think of different technologies and a little bit of shaming other developers. And I think the point we had, and Dylan, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's okay to have opinions about frameworks you like and you don't like. And that's perfectly fine. But then we kind of draw the line if you're shaming other people.
Yeah, and I think I am a little bit of a brash person, and most of the time I'm kidding. But I do think sometimes people get a little bit too, like the fact that we have to even respond to this criticism about people being butthurt about me talking about libraries and frameworks is sort of my whole point of teasing people about this stuff. But I think we should be able to just maybe give our opinions on these things. But again, they're just opinions. That's it. Sometimes if there are facts that go with these things, they'll be mentioned.
Yeah, so let's dive in. So I want to start with a comment that I got on the episode. And if you ever want to comment on any of these episodes, we have our Code Tech and Caffeine Facebook group where you can create a post about it, or Dylan on his YouTube channel posts every single episode of the podcast, so you can also comment there. But one of the comments I got was that I think people misinterpreted what I said about imposter syndrome. So let me give you guys a little bit of recap. In the episode, I said that imposter syndrome is a debilitating problem that a lot of new developers have, and it's this feeling that you don't belong, that you didn't earn what you have accomplished. And I kind of took a view on that said, well, maybe the reason that some people are feeling imposter syndrome is because maybe they just have anxiety. And I really think that I didn't word it well. I think I downplayed that what some people really feel. And for that, I apologize. I probably should have said it a little bit more elegantly. And what I was just trying to say is that, and I think Dylan would agree, that we are both very confident people. Like, we are very confident in our abilities. We both believe we deserve to be where we are at in our careers. So sometimes thinking back on where we were when we first started, it's a little bit more difficult. And I think Dylan could probably relate more than me. But when I was first starting, I did have these feelings of imposter syndrome where, I didn't think I was good enough, and the accomplishments that I had, I didn't deserve them. I do think that hard work played a lot into it, that I wasn't, just because I have a computer science degree, I wasn't just given or handed a job. I had to work my butt off. I failed. If you listen to my episode when I was working as doing tech support for a company for a few years, I had to really work my butt off to go to school and work at the same time. And then when I graduated, I lost my job and I had to find a new one. I had just got married. So, I worked my butt off. Computer science degree helped, but it was a lot about me putting the time in. And I did have some of those feelings, but I think a lot of it, the hard work is what pushed me through. I know. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, so imposter syndrome is an interesting thing, and I think something a lot of people suffer with. And I think specifically about, people like myself who are self-taught, who, when they're getting into the industry, they might think like, oh, I've had a conversation with my girlfriend who's a little nervous to start applying for jobs because she's like, I don't know shit. And there's some truth to that, and there's some apprehension that goes along with it. But I think it's perfectly healthy that that is something that stays in the past. And there are even times now where I think about going back to school, and I think that's related to a bit of lingering imposter syndrome. But there's nothing wrong with being confident in your abilities and trying and overcoming that, and thinking that, you know what, I've earned this and I deserve this and I've put in the time and effort to accomplish it.
Exactly. Would you say if you are just starting out and you're starting to feel this way, that you don't deserve the accomplishments that you've gotten, but really maybe the only accomplishment you got was you studied, but you haven't gotten that first job, and you're feeling this feeling? Isn't it true though that you really haven't accomplished anything? So this isn't technically imposter syndrome. Maybe the only thing you accomplished is you studied. That's what I was trying to make the distinction of. I don't know.
I think a lot of stuff, like one thing that I hate about imposter syndrome is it seems to be this catch-all for like getting it early on in your career. It People are like, oh, I'm anxious about starting a new career. Of course, who wouldn't be? I'm anxious about getting a new job. Oh, of course, who wouldn't be? I'm anxious about keeping my job. Of course, who wouldn't be? Like, it's a little bit too broad, and so like I think part of what people are picked up on in that episode is it definitely seems to be one of those items that people are okay with lingering in their life and throwing into this bucket. And maybe my thought is it's okay in minute doses, but it needs to be something that isn't part of our lives.
Yes, and if it is a part of your life, then I think maybe talking to someone else, talking to maybe a therapist, or just taking. I always remember the poor man's therapy is just taking long walks and just trying to think over things. I don't know.
Just
I want to acknowledge that this is real and it happens to a lot of people, and I empathize. It's hard for a lot of people.
yeah, and I would say
Did I cut out there?
a little bit, but I think everyone got the sentiment of Eric understands. and he wants you to feel good. Part of what I would say, sort of my closing comment on that, is that if you are dealing with imposter syndrome, get so good that there's no way you're an imposter. That would be, you'll be the developer that is so good at work that it'll be very self-evident by those who you surround yourself with.
That's a good way to end that. Okay, so another comment that came up a lot during this imposter syndrome episode, actually not a lot, just a couple of comments, was we had mentioned PHP, and PHP is the punching bag of people kind of crap on PHP a little bit. And I think modern PHP with Laravel and all the different frameworks is awesome, but it still feels like it's not as popular. And I think at the end you had mentioned something about 90% of the web is ran by WordPress sites, basically PHP, but that was 90% of the web that people don't go to. I think that was a joke, and some people may have taken that the wrong way.
Yeah. I mean, it's somewhat of a joke. It's somewhat true. So it's a joke because it's yes, a large portion of the web actually is based off PHP, but a large portion of that is sort of pre-Laravel PHP. And if you look at a lot of sort of modern sites that people are using, they're not typically architected in PHP, and there's nothing wrong with that. But more so, I just like to shit on PHP. There's few technologies that I have no problem poking fun at. jQuery is one of them. Oh my god, I hate me some jQuery. PHP, Bootstrap, Internet Explorer. There's probably a few more, but those are the ones that come to mind.
So do you think that there's just like a lot of websites out there that are dead, that used to be old WordPress sites? Is that kind of your thought behind it?
No. So dead is like a hard term. So there's a lot of PHP sites that probably aren't being actively maintained, and there's not really all that much. It's like the PHP sites, in my mind, fall into legacy development, and that doesn't mean that there's not new projects being spun up, but I would say that's the exception to the rule.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. If you guys have Any more comments about our imposter syndrome? You can leave in the comments.
I think people who are upset about my PHP comments are still going to be upset after this this comment. But we'll leave it at that.
Well, let's talk about dependency issues. So in episode 17 was the tech rant episode. And speaking of jQuery, that's the one where you had mentioned that you don't like jQuery. Honestly, I think I didn't see any negativity about that. I think people realize that jQuery and some of these other language or frameworks, libraries, people are still using, that they are kind of getting less popular. They are being used as cruxes for a lot of developers. And I think your point was, and a lot of this was, that it's okay to use jQuery, but you should know, but if you're using jQuery instead of doing it outside of jQuery, or you're using these UI component libraries when you can actually create the component and you don't know how to create the component, then that's a problem.
Yeah, I think there's a good portion of our job which is finding the right tool for the job. But there's also a good portion of our job where it's actually building that tool. And people oftentimes don't build things enough. And it's kind of crazy because, like, that's what you usually think of when you're getting started. Like, oh, hey, I'm going to build this item. And, there's a little bit of... I guess to summarize, my issue is that developers are being dependent upon libraries rather than fundamentals and core technologies.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. In fact, you put your money where your mouth is. You're creating a new course where you say, hey, look, I created 100 components. I didn't even use a library. This is how you do it, which is pretty phenomenal. Do you want to plug that?
Oh, sure. That was a layout. Well, it's not out yet, but it will be, and it'll be the 100 Angular challenge, and we'll have a couple spin-offs eventually. But it's pretty cool stuff. Not only are we building components, we're building services, directives, all the sort of stuff that you'd expect in an Angular course. That was a layup, and I completely fluffed it, didn't I?
And if people want to get to know more about that, then just follow you on YouTube. I'm sure you'll be.
Yeah, I'll be plugging it there with the alley-oop plugs. All right.
For sure. And one thing I wanted to mention on episode 17, the tech rant episode, is that I mentioned about dependencies and how kind of terrible they are, and how we have one package that relies on another package that relies on another package. And if one package downstream breaks, it breaks everything. And someone rightly commented that, and we were talking specifically about LeftPad, that with the package.lock.json file helps kind of prevent some of those, because the package lock file will make sure you have a specific version of code, and that should be in your repository too. That should be checked in, and then that it's less likely for packages downstream to break and to break your package.
Yeah, I think less likely is the key there, because I've had plenty of times where my package lock has been jacked up and I had to delete that and then reinstall all my dependencies.
Yep. All right, so that's all I want to talk about on episode 17, the tech rant episode. So let's deep dive into a little bit more, and I kind of have an update to this. So we had this episode 5 where we're talking about living in an agile world, and I think this is one of our most popular episodes. And a lot of people liked it, including the money episode that we did at the beginning, and Dylan's episode too. Well, I think going back to some of our talk about this, and we talked a lot about how there's these different steps in an agile workflow where you have this time where you're creating and you're getting ready for the sprint beforehand, and then the sprint starts, and then you have like a demo and a retrospective at the end, and then you have backlog grooming sessions, and I just wanted to say that, being in a business that has tried, and a few businesses that have tried to adhere to this agile workflow, there's no perfect solution. And what I mean by that is, I've seen this happen a lot, and something we didn't touch on in the episode was that the story process, where you actually, maybe management has an idea and they bring it down to product, and the product works with business analysts or maybe the product owner themselves to write the stories, and then it usually gets tasked out by development. that process is oftentimes breaks down. And what I mean by that is, like, sometimes what the product owners are wanting, they'll maybe write in the story, but it's pretty vague. And then by the time it gets to the developers, they'll try to implement what they believe is the story wants. But what the story wants isn't necessarily what the actual developer perceives it as. So you'll get times where the developer will create something, and then once QA and product owner looks at it, they'll be like, well, that's not really what we want. So there's this kind of dichotomy. Should the product owners spend hours and hours to put every little tiny detail in the story? That way the developer can know exactly what the product owner wants. Or should they create like just some vague, but maybe how much time should they put into writing the story versus how much time the developer has to work on it, and how is that collaboration? I just want to throw that out there. I don't know if I know a great solution, but what do you think about that, Dylan?
Yeah, so I mean, I have an opinion about this that's slightly different than what's the real world is. And I would say, generally speaking, your product owner, their full-time job isn't just being a product owner. They're oftentimes maybe a executive that's doing other things, and you're building this product for a portion of the business that they oversee. And so, you might see them once a week, once every 2 weeks, and they might spend a fourth of their time doing the sort of product owner role. Now, I have always been of the mindset that if I'm unclear, I send it back. I don't care if you want it tomorrow. This is what it is. And sometimes I'll create some resources. Maybe I'll pull out Balsamic to if it's a UI thing. Sometimes I'll, I always don't mind interacting with the product owner, but my scrum masters and business analysts try and keep me the hell away from them, I guess. So I'll have them go and say, listen, you gotta go get more detail. If they don't do it, it doesn't get done. So they go and do it. But that's my sentiment. Now, I would like to live in a world where we have product owners who are dedicated 40 hours a week, but I don't necessarily know that is, unless you're building a commercial application where you plan on selling it, which a good portion of developers are building things internally, like for business use, that maybe they'll commercialize at some point. But I would say that's probably not the norm.
I see. I think I've worked at companies where we had a dedicated product owner, and they work really close with the executive management, but they're not executive management. So there was no, like, you can't contact the product owner. If we had to do a demo or if I had a question, I would just hit them up on Slack. But I know some organizations, like, the product owner is like a VP or someone really high up, and you're like, ooh, I can't bother them. But at that point, I think that the roles are misaligned. I don't know. What do you think? You think?
Well, I mean, I typically would like to go through the business analyst because it's the business analyst that's usually working with the product owner to generate the stories and really understand the product. I look at this the product owner is the want. This is what I want, and this is the vision. The business analyst needs to understand the product and be able to communicate that. So they're kind of the middleman. So it's not always that the product owner is unavailable in the sense of like, oh, hey, we don't deal with these peon devs, right? It's more, you could have a product owner that actually manages 3 different products, and they have a limited amount of time. And so, like, it can't go into all these details. So I think at the end of the day, I'd like to be able to go and reach out to these people, and I do when I can, when it's appropriate. But I also try not to step a little bit too much on the business analyst's toes, because that it does, in my eyes, fall into their job category a bit.
Sometimes in organizations, your product owner is also a product manager, and sometimes those are synonymous. Like, the product manager is the same as the product owner. And some, like, I've worked at a few places where we don't have business analysts, and so the product owner has to write up the requirements, has to put them in the stories, and then, yeah, there's no one in the middle term. I know also having a dedicated UX person, especially for the front end, that can kind of intercept the product owner's stories before they get to the developer is really handy, because then they can work with the product owner and the business analyst to actually put a sketch together of what it's supposed to look like. And I think what is it? Picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes that really helps,
Yeah,
especially when you're trying to work with a complicated feature.
I think it's worth mentioning too, because we're throwing out a lot of roles, and if you've probably picked up that some things are different by company, and that's true. It also depends how large of a company you work at and how financially secure they are, because at smaller companies you're going to wear a lot of hats, right? You're going to be the front end, the back end, the UI UX. You might be the product owner for all you know, right? You might be QA. And as you sort of progress in your career and you go to larger companies that have a bit of a bigger bankroll, what you'll start to see is that not only do you sort of niche down, but the roles around you do, where now people are specializing in things. And um, this, so some of these roles may overlap at certain companies, and it may be dependent on size and money and how much they're, how important the project is to them.
It's funny, you can go and work at a company where you are doing UI, UX, front end, maybe even some of the back end, but you're paid less than someone that's just doing the front end at a bigger company, because the reason they don't have that many positions open is because they probably can't afford it. So let's keep an eye out on that.
It is somewhat comical that as your career progresses, you do less and get paid more. Like there's something very funny about that. At least that's sort of been my opinion.
And I think by do less, you mean you're not stretched as much. You're just specializing in one thing, because you end up doing not the same amount of work. You just don't have 10 things to separate your mind with.
Yeah. I would say the two parts there. One, you're doing one less task but more of it, and two, the worse paying the job, the more they want, the more that is expected typically. It's like, and the more hours they want out of you. At least that's been my experience, where it's like you're and it's kind of the growing pains of getting experience. You got to take what you can get, and then you move on to better companies and bigger companies and better benefits and stuff like that. And it's an interesting thing, though. It's kind of comical.
Hey, I want to touch on one other thing. You mentioned during that episode that you have reviews at the end of each sprint, and then you combine it with your retrospective. And you said that your product owners are so busy sometimes they can't make it to the reviews. Is that still the case, or did you guys, and how does that work with the retrospective if the product owner's in there? Do they just listen to you guys gripe about what was wrong with the sprint?
Yeah, so and it's so I haven't had that issue at my current company, where the product owner isn't showing up to see the product. They're actively invested. But I have been at other parts of the company, at other companies, where they only showed up for like major releases, not fine tunings, but they would on their own time go through the web app and see what's there, and go through it, and they empowered the project manager and BA there. But in terms of the retrospective, we include our product owner and everybody else, literally directors, senior directors, for like which is interesting, because like part of it is I'm very vocal, so like I got something to say every sprint, but there are a lot of people who are a little bit more shy, who they're like, it's not uncommon for the average person to be like, want to just put a smile on and be like, everything's great. Everything's great. I swear to God, everything's great. We got high up people here. But sometimes people just need to remember, like, they're just normal people like everybody else, and they want to be involved, right? They don't want you to, there's plenty of other people just lying straight to their face. So if there's issues, you need to raise those issues up so that they can get resolved, because they might actually be the people that say, hey, we're going to get this resolved. And one thing that I can say that they have had a hand in was the project that I was on had no testing. I was like, this is going to solve an issue. And I harped on it for about 3 retros. And now our app is at like 60% tested and on its way to be about 90% within the next 3 months. And we have less bugs in production. And so, like, if you're not going to tell them, and sometimes it's a little hard because you don't want to send a messenger. That's one thing. And the messenger oftentimes is the project manager, is the business analyst. And if you have opportunities to take advantage of, like, no messenger, this is the message. This is the message. There's nothing in between. You should take advantage of that.
And I like the idea too of this is speaking up during your retrospectives, but also I think if you have a problem with a particular person, you never call out someone in any of these meetings. At least I don't think you should. But you could bring that up to your manager later. I like the idea of keeping some of these negative things private, but more the general things, what the retrospectives for is for you to get out and talk about the process and what you liked and didn't like about it.
Yeah, and we sort of harped on the negative aspects, but that doesn't mean that you can't speak positively about other things, about things that are working well. That's just as important so that they know to, hey, let's keep doing this. And so, like, I know one thing, I was pissed off that they made me go into the office for 2 weeks because I work full remote, and I felt like it wasn't necessary and that maybe there's other ways to tackle whatever it is that the reasons they want us to bring us in. And I was vocal about that. And then the next sprint, we were back into our normal cadence, and, they said, okay, well, we tried it and clearly they didn't like it. And so go from there. So, there are things that you want to share, the good and the bad.
That's a good point. Yeah, a good Scrum Master will start off with, okay, everybody tell me what went right on this sprint. Now tell me what went wrong on this sprint. And hopefully the rights and wrongs are equal, or at least you have more rights than wrongs. All right, I think we have harped on that to death. I want to mention one other thing that I kind of want to talk to you, Dylan. I think this is an interesting topic, is that we briefly touched upon the continuous integration, continuous deployment, and what that means for different teams. And you had rightfully pointed out during the episode that when you have continuous deployment, that's usually you're going directly to master. And I wanted to talk to you about a modification of that and what's worked with some teams that I've worked with. And that is that we still have we still have some tenets of going straight to production, but the way it works is, do you guys use, or maybe previous companies, we're not going to talk about our current companies, but previous companies, did you guys use like the typical Git branching strategy where you have a development branch, QA branch, a UAT or staging, and then master is production?
I've used that at a couple locations. I've also worked at places where you just have branches that get merged into master, and then you choose what build you want to release out into the world.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to talk about. You ruined my thunder. That's another way of doing a CI/CD pipeline that we didn't get to in this episode. Is that what you do is you just have this master branch, and everybody pushes to master. And the way it works is master gets promoted to QA. When QA is ready, it gets promoted to your UAT, or sometimes called staging environment, and then that gets promoted into production. And the advantages of that is that you don't have this problem where you have like 5-6 different branches, and you're not sure what's in each branch, and then sometimes you'll have a hot fix that has to go through all the branches to get to production really quickly, and sometimes one branch will be off the other branch, and then you have to have these huge merges. And I don't know if you've ever done this where you've had like hundreds and hundreds of pull requests.
I did it Friday, like literally 2 days ago.
Oh yeah, so you had like merge conflict hell, and like it doesn't, like, I think Git, once you have like hundreds of changes or hundreds of pull requests, it has problems.
Yeah, and it tends to deal with, like, my issues usually stem from, so we've done quite a bit of refactoring in our current app, but there is some of that older code that hasn't been touched, but it got touched this time. But then you have 1,000+ lines of HTML that get shifted by 1 or 2 lines, and then you have, boom, you got hundreds of lines that you're going through and saying, is this right? Did I get this right? And it's just like you go line by line. It's awful.
You know what's happened to me recently too is that, I don't know, something happening with my Prettier plugin or the way we set up Prettier in our Angular project. So all of a sudden when I was saving, it wasn't auto-formatting, or it was auto-formatting it slightly different from the other developer. So when we did pull requests, it would be like, oh, there's like these 100 changes in this one file, and all it is just something shifted over because the Prettier didn't save it correctly.
That could be editor config. If someone doesn't have editor config in their if you have it in your project but you don't have the extension, if they're using VS Code, because I've had that same issue, it doesn't actually take effect without the extension.
The editor config?
Yeah, editor config extension. I don't know if that's the case, but I've had that issue, and that was what it was for me. Yeah.
Good to know. So I was just saying that you could have, and we call this CI/CD, but it's not technically CI/CD, where instead of having a sprint, we're continuously pushing everything to master. It's getting to QA. QA is testing it, promoting it to our UAT or staging environment, and then once product and everything signs off on it, it goes to production, and then we grab the next stuff off the top of the list of the backlog. And so you can get to a point where you have all these automated tests running. Every time you're pushing code, you're pushing multiple code twice a day. You don't have to deal with these branches, and then you're continuously pushing to master. And so that's kind of one technique of doing the CI/CD pipeline. There is some disadvantages if you're working on a big feature and it's in QA and they're not done testing it, but you have another feature that you need to push out, then you can be held up in QA. And there's a couple ways you can get around that. One is using something called feature flagging. We actually looked into this. I was just at AWS reInvent, and there's like a ton of companies that do special feature flagging that'll hook into code in your front end where you can turn things on or off really easily. There's also ways you can roll it your own using config files. You can also roll back changes from QA and push in your changes that you need to get out quicker. So there's a couple of ways of handling that by just having one branch.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of feature toggles. I didn't like them at first because it's an extra step in your code, and oftentimes you have to go in eventually and remove the toggles. So there's a little bit of that. But if it was up to me, everything would be feature toggled. I absolutely love it.
Is there any packages or libraries or services that you use?
Yeah, the service I've used a couple times now has been Launch Darkly. They seem to be pretty big in the space. And one benefit to feature toggles is not only be able to toggle things on and off, whether they're working or not, but they also allow you to do A/B testing where, let's say I want to actually collect data on who's using it, or I only want to show this feature to 5% of the users and just see how they're using it, see if it's working right. So you don't necessarily have to release something out into the wild and be like, oh, cool, 100% of users saw that it blew up. Well, instead you could, with the toggle, you could give it to 5%, see if anybody likes it, and or if not only if they like it, but if it's any good. And you hear a lot, quite frequently now about like, oh, Facebook or YouTube are testing X amount of features with certain users, and the reason they're doing that is to gather data, see, hey, we think this is right. But maybe it's wrong. Let's see how people are using it, and then let's go back. Let's take it off the table and reiterate on it.
I have heard of them. That's excellent. I will look into that more. We're trying to find one. I know, you mentioned Facebook and Google. I know an anecdote that I heard is that when you start at Facebook or Google, I think they said Facebook, you will be writing a line of code that's going to be pushed to production in your first week or two. And I'm almost guarantee that if you're pushing code to production in Facebook, it's not going to all 2 billion people. They probably just, the new developers probably get to push code that gets turned on in, people in North America.
Yeah, their family and friends, so they can see, look, Mom, I did that.
Exactly. And I think that lends itself to a sophisticated organization that you are able to do these feature flags. You're using a product like that, and then you have a DevOps organization that's doing artifact promotion, things like that, because it can get quite complicated when you start deep diving into the CI/CD world. I was just at AWS reInvent, which is Amazon's really big developer conference every year, and I heard all the things they're doing. I mean, Kubernetes, all the different services they offer. It makes a lot of sense. Everybody's containerizing their back end. I mean, we've been doing that for a while, but I think it's only been popular in the last few years. Let's move on. Let's talk about, let's change directions a little bit and talk about senior developers. We touched on this, I believe, a little bit in the imposter syndrome episode, but I think this is a topic we wanted to get to, and we didn't really expand on this much. And what makes a senior software developer? And I'd love to hear what you think about this, Dylan, because I think in the past, when we think of people with experience in anything, like for example, an airplane pilot, we talk about the amount of hours they have flown, and that is an indication of how much experience they have. So if this person has 10,000 hours of flown hours, we know that they're probably a better pilot than if one guy that only has 1,000 hours flown. In fact, you can't get your pilot license, you have to have a certain amount of hours flown in the air without an instructor, or with an instructor, depending on the certification. to be actually considered a pilot. So in software development, obviously we're not flying anything, but it seems like that years of experience is not as important in some ways. And what I mean by that, well, let me ask you this: does having 10 years of experience no longer matter? And then how do we judge developers then without looking at the amount of years of experience they have?
Yeah, so I do think it's one factor. And I would say, and I say this having not worked in other industries, so take this with a grain of salt, right? I'm not an expert on, but I would say that as far as software development goes, that years of experience is one factor that's weighed at a slightly lower scale than in other industries. Now, part of that is because our job is very skill based, things that are testable, things that are knowledge based, that you could find out exactly where, not maybe not exactly, but you can get in the ballpark of where individuals are.
Yeah, I think that's true. It is one gauge of someone's experience. But what I've seen is that there's a lot of junior developers come out, a lot of smart people like yourself that are coming out that have 2, 3, 4 years of experience that now are senior developers. And so in the past, we had these job openings that said senior developer 8+ years of experience or 7+ years of experience. And I still think that job ads really emphasize years of experience for senior developers. But it seems like it's not black and white that years of experience really equals senior developer anymore. And I think you've said before in the past, Dylan, that you've seen senior developers that are still stuck, or they have the title senior developer, but they're still stuck in that junior or mid-level tier thought process. So it feels like it's no longer, it doesn't matter as much as it does in other industries, but it's kind of gives me thought, kind of takes me back a second to think about, well, then how do we gauge people when we hire people? How, as someone with me who's on the opposite side of the coin that has over 10 years of experience, how do I show an employer that the experience that I got is relevant to the job and that I would work better than someone that has maybe 2 years of experience, but they consider themselves a senior developer? Like how do you rate that? And then if everybody's a senior developer after 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, how do we judge? How do we pay people? I don't know. It's just kind of a interesting topic that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it's one that's partially I don't want to call it an issue, but partially part of the reason that it exists, so this is even a question, is because the industry has grown so rapidly that as people have been, comparatively speaking to other professions that have been going at a very linear sort of growth or stagnating, software development has exponentially grown, and so have the candidates going into it. So the majority of candidates, like I'm pulling this number based off of Stack Overflow's 2019 survey, 41% of all professional developers have been doing it for less than 5 years, and close to 70% have been less than 9. So it's it's one of those items I think that typically in terms of years of experience is very heavily weighted in the front just to the nature of the job, which also brings up like, okay, well, maybe instead of doing 10 years for a senior, you see roles at 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is, because almost half the candidates have left less than 5 years.
I think that's interesting. Yeah. So we have a lot of new people. I mean, if you look at React just came out 6 years ago. So, I mean, we can't have React developers 10+ years of experience. Although a lot of job openings, they say they're looking for a senior developer, senior React developer. They'll put in caveats that we want 8 years of overall development experience, 3+ years of React experience, 2+ years of Node experience. And that's how they gauge if someone is a senior developer or not. I know when I've interviewed people, we've looked at years of experience and we've weeded out people that don't have enough years of experience as just an indicator that they're probably more junior, which might be unfair to a lot of people that could have easily done the job, but we didn't give them a chance because their resume shows they only had 3 years of experience and we were looking for people for 8+ years of experience.
Yeah, and I think every organization judges differently how they're going to evaluate candidates, right? So I personally am willing to give people more of a shot that have less years of experience if they have a track record of learning, which I think is a very important trait to have in software development. And by track record, I mean I can see through their actions, their GitHub, their projects, whatever it is, that they have actively been attempting to improve, and I can see it. I don't care what they tell me. Like, people will tell you, I learn every day, and like, but what I can actually see on my own. But there are other people who, we're not taking anybody that has less than 5 years experience. There are people who say, hey, we're not taking anyone that doesn't have a bachelor's or a master's. And I would say, generally speaking, that sentiment has been going away, where people are willing to consider people that maybe in the past they wouldn't have, if they can, if they have sufficient ways to test their skill.
But let's move on to, I think this is going to be our last topic today. And maybe 2 more topics. We'll see. Gatekeeping in software development. And what I mean by that is that people like to put labels on everyone. And you say, you be like, you're a software developer. You're not a software developer. And so I've seen this where we don't want to gatekeep people. If someone just works on HTML and CSS, they're a developer. If you are if you work in Python, you're a developer. But what I'm trying to get at is, should we do some sort of gatekeeping? For example, if you're just starting to learn how to program, are you a programmer? What kind of gatekeeping do we put on this industry at all? Or should we have no gatekeeping at all? And that could also go to having a degree or not, which we used to be a gatekeeper for people getting into this industry, but it's becoming less and less.
It's funny. It reminds me of this comment someone left the other day, where I don't have a degree, and I oftentimes will refer to myself as a software engineer, and someone's like, you're not a software engineer, you don't have a degree. I was like, just because I don't, and I responded back, I was like, just because I don't have a degree doesn't mean I'm not an engineer. And he goes, they said something along the lines of like, even trash guys can call themselves sanitation engineers if they want, or some shit like that. But it kind of reminds me of that. But so this is what I would say to this is that I don't care what you call yourself. And if you working for somebody else isn't something that necessarily needs to define you. But if someone is paying you good money to build software for them, you're definitely fall into that, you are engineering software, you're a programmer, you're a developer. If you are, outside of work, you're building something, cool, man, have fun, do that. But we don't necessarily need to throw tags on anybody. It helps when you're doing things professionally. Like, I use LinkedIn. I'm not a LinkedIn guy. I play video games. I don't go and refer to myself as a video gamer. Like, it's just, these are hobbies, these are things. And if you're building software as a hobby, and you can program. I wouldn't necessarily define myself as a programmer until I've made that a profession, because that to me this is a profession term.
I know engineering in some countries requires a specific degree or certification. So technically you cannot call yourself a software engineer unless you have a certification, because that is something you can put on your resume and it signifies that you've completed something. But in the US, it's pretty lax, at least in the engineering side.
Yeah, I also call myself a coding god, but I'm not a god, just in case anybody was curious. I think this falls into semantics. I think this is one of those things that people like to put labels on themselves and others, and it's probably not healthy to do that. And also, does it really matter at the end of the day?
Maybe it's more of a mind shift thing, because once you start thinking you're a programmer, then you start acting more like a programmer. So it's more
what does that mean? What do you mean?
Oh.
Like, you write code? Like, yeah, if you're programming, you write code. But what does it mean you act more like a programmer?
Well, we have these labels, and if we like it or not, we identify as certain things in our life. So some of us identify as a programmer, some identify as a gamer, like you mentioned. But once you identify in your mind, you're psychologically set to think a certain way, then you start behaving certain things. You take on certain traits that the label that you put on yourself hits you with. So if you're a programmer, you're probably more likely to be in technology, and you're probably more likely to try to obviously program. And so, but when you don't think you're a programmer and you haven't put that label on yourself and it's just a hobby, then you approach things differently. I guess that's what I mean. So maybe that's when you can kind of technically call yourself a programmer. It's not something someone else tells you. It's just when you make that shift.
Okay. I guess I'm trying to. I guess where my confusion comes from is what we were trying to get out of this. Like, should we have gatekeeping? Like, what is the harm of the gatekeeping, and versus what is the benefit, the pros and the cons of gatekeeping? I'm still confused about that, because to me, it's one of those items that, what are you know, how is it hurting you, or how is it hurting other people, or vice versa benefiting? And I still don't see it.
I think the idea behind gatekeeping, and I don't agree with this, is that we want to limit the amount of people inside this industry to make it more exclusive than some people would think it to be, that, we can get paid more, we would have less competition, that it takes a certain skill that you need to become a developer. And then if we have these gatekeepers like college education or computer science degree or years of experience, that would prevent, we would have less people in the overall pool. We would have higher quality people. We would have people that do a better job.
Okay.
That's the same reason, like, some states have raw laws that you can't become a hairdresser unless you get a certification, and that costs thousands of dollars for hairdressers to go through a 10-week or 12-week school, and they have to get a certification. And some other people will say, it's like, well, why can't we just have everyone be a hairdresser? Why can't you just teach yourself to be a hairdresser? I mean, nobody's dying getting a haircut.
There is gatekeeping. It's just on the corporation level or the company level, where companies have the ability to get the talent that they want. Now, if they want the best developers, they have to pay the most. They have to be the most attractive. They have to, if they want to snipe me away from my current job, if I fell into that category,
that will never happen.
Never. I'm loyal.
No, I know you are.
No, but you would have to make it an attractive offer. And so there is gatekeeping. If you run a company, there are things that you can literally say, we're not hiring anyone without a PhD. We're not hiring anyone without 7 to 8 years experience in these roles. And you can do that. But there is a supply and a demand associated with it. Part of the reason that the gatekeeping, as now I understand what we're talking about here. We're talking about haters. This is, I figured it out. People who hate that other people are coming into their industry. That's how I see it. That there's a huge demand for software engineers that is still not being met. And yeah, you're going to have some people that slide in and see an easy payday. But oftentimes those people are going to stay in the lower rungs, and they're not going to progress their career. But you're also going to let a lot of people in who are hardworking, who have the skills. But there are ways to gatekeep. I don't know that we need to. And I'm more so, this is not good to go like a conservative liberal thing, but I more so believe that we want to have less rules in place and leave it to the individual companies of how they want to run their business.
As long as it's not discriminatory, of course. I mean, they're giving everyone a fair shot.
Is it not discriminatory not to hire someone because they don't have a bachelor's degree? Because I'm hoping by 2025 that's a thing someday.
Well, 15 years ago, that was pretty much the norm. You had to have at least a college degree. And most job openings, equivalent experience was always there, but it wasn't as important as it is now.
Yeah, it's interesting what you can say, what things are like okay to be discriminatory against, because it is. I mean, anytime you filter, you're discriminating. That's all it is. It's just I'm filtering based off of this. So
like filtering for years of experience is probably not that bad. But filtering on college is probably a little bit worse. And then, of course, completely racist if you filter on anything like your age or your race or anything like that.
You are discriminating against people with less years of experience, which is kind of the intent, right?
But most companies would say that's fine. Like we want people with more experience. There's not an easy way to determine if someone is a really great developer, because beyond the exceptions to the rule, which there always will be, most people that have a year of experience are probably really junior, and they probably can't take on a senior developer role. So I understand that. All right, so that's all I had. Do you want to comment on anything else?
I did, and I know you don't necessarily want to talk about this, so I'll make it brief. But there seems to be, and this is a tech industry issue as a whole, I would say, but it's been prevalent in sort of the YouTube and the sort of software engineering public space, I guess, where you have developers like Eric and myself, and people on podcasts and YouTube channels. There seems to be a little bit of a lack of morality in recent times, where we have developers who are plagiarizing, where we have, or I should say developers. I'm trying to keep this very vague so we don't call anybody out, because that's not what this is about. It's about raising questions and bringing things to the forefront of people's minds, where we have people who are plagiarizing, we have people who are perhaps doing shady business tactics, we have people who are just being mean and rude a lot of times. There's just a lot of, and then you have, on the larger scale, you have companies who, it seems like every week we hear about a company doing some shady illegal stuff, or doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, like legally or just even morally. And I I I'm not one here to sit up on a pedestal and tell you that I'm perfect. I haven't made mistakes. I think we all make mistakes, and I don't think you should judge somebody by those mistakes. And I also don't think you should, there's been developers who have been vocal and had a strong stance that they have been willing to stand up for and say, listen, I can say whatever I want. Doesn't mean that you have to sponsor what I'm saying. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. And there's nothing immoral about that. And if there's consequences because of that, that's fine. I don't think we should look down upon these people. I'm more so talking about people who are really just doing immoral stuff in my eyes. And I don't want to necessarily judge anybody by one action, but when it starts becoming actions, start thinking about, are these people of character and how they affect the community? Because I do think in general that we are who we surround ourselves with, and now in 2019, that means even digitally, even people that there's a lot of people who I don't know very well, in the sense, like, I've never met them, but I have conversations with them frequently. Like, Eric and I have never met each other in person, but here we are doing a podcast together, we're working on projects together, talking, we've gone into business transactions, we've done all this stuff together. So I'm very concerned that there's a bit of a moral compass issue. And I think part of it is because we're engineers. I think as logical people, sometimes we can sit down and we can evaluate the cost of a relationship and weighs the pros and cons. If I hand this in, I do this illegal stuff, what is the cost benefit analysis? And I don't think that's a healthy thing to do.
I think it's also just the part of the YouTube drama world that we live in now, where creators call out other creators, where they know if you say something bad about someone that it will get a lot of views. They know if they create a controversy, they take an idea someone else had, or that could also cause views and bring up your perceived, I don't know, influence. So I think that has something to do with it too. And I've seen some of the things rolling around, which most of the time I don't look at. And I think, Dylan, you're the same way, but it pops up on our feeds. And then all this controversy comes out. I kind of, I like to sometimes, like anybody else, it's like watching a car wreck. You kind of watch it. You're like, whoa, what's happening? What's happening here? But I think for the most part, I try to stay out of some of those controversies, and I see where both sides are coming from on some of them.
Yeah, and my concern is not necessarily with us. Like, we're grown ass men. We've been working in the industry for a while. My concern is more about some younger, maybe the people are like 18 to 25 or even younger, that are, these people, a lot of times they look up to them. They're like, man, look how great she is doing. This is great. I should listen to their advice. They're killing it. Meanwhile, they've lied about how they got there. They've misinformed. They're spreading, false information. And not only that, they're showing people what is an acceptable way to act? And I feel like a grandfather having to have this even conversation. It's just like something my grandparents would sit me down and talk to me about. But it's disgusting to me that I'll give you a fun thing I learned in one of the Chris Hawk's videos I watched, that one of the top 10 most followed developers on GitHub is a known plagiarist, someone who has plagiarized and been proven to plagiarize on numerous occasions. But literally one of the, I think the 7th or 8th, something like that, followed developers and individuals, and it's a unfortunate thing that is the case of the world, and some people don't know, and it's misleading. It's like telling people who want to become developers, hey, I could teach you to be a developer in 30 days. It's just going to cost you $2,000, but I'll teach you. It's one of those things where a lot of it is snake oil, and people are willing to veer from morality way too often and by way too much that it's upsetting.
Maybe money has a lot to do with it too. Kind of a bad recipe, money and greed and some of these things. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, those are the things that get you to do it, right? There's reasons. Very few people are just bad for the sake of being bad. They want to get something out of it. Maybe they like the fame aspect. Maybe they like the money aspect. It's one of those items where there are reasons for these bad choices, and again, it's not that I want to call anybody out individually or that I think there's no redemption, but I do think as individuals, as content creators, as just people who are software engineers and aspiring engineers, that we have to think about what it is that we're doing. And if we're setting an example, we're going to be proud of, right? And that's not going to say we're not going to make mistakes. I've made plenty. But at some point, these things become character defining rather than mistakes.
For sure. Do you think some of these things will haunt people in the future? Like future jobs, future employment? We're living in the age of social media. Everything you and me say on this podcast, someone could potentially look at one day and not like.
I think so, but I also think at some point that a lot of people that we're sort of inadvertently referencing, they have no interest in working in their field anymore. They're much more interested in being YouTubers, and this is sort of the path that they have taken. So this doesn't necessarily care, but it will, for those of you who maybe fall off down the road and they're not making as much money. I can tell you from my channel, and I don't really have a channel that's very spicy, and pretty much everything I've made has been 100% created, or anything I have created, I've given, hey, this is a resource I used and dedicated to that has cost me jobs, just because employers are sometimes wary of someone who puts stuff out into the world, because you're a reflection of their value as well.
All right, I think that wraps it up for today. If you guys have any thoughts on anything we've talked about, feel free to check out Dylan's YouTube channel. Leave a comment on there. Check out our Code Tech and Caffeine. Leave a comment there. Let us know. Yeah, make sure you guys leave some comments and share and let everyone know. And I think it's season 2. I think we should make this a thing where season 2, or every season, we do one, like, let's address some criticism. Because I think it makes it, you and I are having a conversation, but so are other people listening to this. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at eric.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members, and you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.